In 1928, a woman named Catherine Donahue, one of the infamous Radium Girls, had to have her jaw removed due to radiation poisoning from painting watch faces with glowing radium. And even after that, she still had to endure the agony of having her bones literally disintegrate. A gruesome fate that would eventually claim her life. This was just the beginning of a dark history that would expose the horrific consequences of industrial greed and the brutal suppression of workers' rights, particularly women's rights. The Radium Girls, as they came to be known, were hundreds of women who were employed to paint watch faces with radium-laced paint. And their story is one of the most shocking industrial disasters in history. But here's where it gets dark. These women were not just victims of circumstance. They were deliberately misled and exploited by their employers, who knew the dangers of radium but chose to ignore them. And this is where everything fell apart. The story begins in the early 1900s, when radium was first discovered and became a highly sought-after element for its glow-in-the-dark properties. Companies like the United States Radium Corporation and the Waterbury Clock Company began hiring women to paint watch faces with radium-laced paint, promising them a safe and lucrative job. The women, mostly teenagers and young adults, were thrilled to have the opportunity to work and earn a steady income. And they were willing to do whatever it took to keep their jobs. They were instructed to moisten their brushes with their tongues to create a fine point, unaware that this would lead to ingestion of the toxic radium, and as a result, they would soon begin to suffer from radiation poisoning, a condition that would change their lives forever. Nobody talks about this part, but the companies knew that radium was highly toxic and that prolonged exposure could be fatal. Yet they chose to keep this information from their employees, prioritizing profits over people. As the years went by, the Radium Girls began to fall ill, one by one, suffering from a range of symptoms including anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would eventually become known as radium jaw. They were in constant pain, and their bodies began to deteriorate at an alarming rate. But despite their suffering, they were met with resistance and denial by their employers, who refused to acknowledge the link between radium and their illnesses. The women were told that they were suffering from syphilis or other diseases, and that their condition was not related to their work. But the Radium Girls knew that something was terribly wrong, and they began to fight for justice, demanding that their employers take responsibility for their actions. But here's where it gets even darker. The companies hired doctors to testify that the women's illnesses were not caused by radium. And they even went so far as to bribe officials to look the other way. And this is where the true horror of the story begins to unfold. The Radium Girls, led by women like Catherine Donahue and Pearl Payne, began to organize and fight for their rights. But they were met with brutal corporate resistance. The companies refused to acknowledge the dangers of radium, and they even went so far as to intimidate and silence the women, trying to prevent them from speaking out about their experiences. The women were forced to undergo humiliating and painful medical examinations, and they were even subjected to radiation tests, which only made their condition worse. And as the years went by, the Radium Girls began to disappear, one by one, their bodies ravaged by the very substance they had once been so eager to work with. And this is where everything fell apart. In 1928, Catherine Donahue, one of the most prominent Radium Girls, filed a lawsuit against the United States Radium Corporation, demanding compensation for her injuries. And this lawsuit would change the course of history. But not before the Radium Girls had to endure even more suffering and hardship. The lawsuit, which became known as Donahue vs. United States Radium Corporation, was a landmark case that would expose the dark truth about the Radium Girls and the companies that had exploited them. The trial was a sensationalized media event, with the Radium Girls testifying about their experiences and the horrific conditions they had endured. And as the evidence mounted, it became clear that the companies had knowingly and deliberately put the women's lives at risk, prioritizing profits over people. But here's where it gets even more shocking. The companies had even gone so far as to manipulate the evidence, hiding documents and testimony that would have incriminated them. And it was only through the bravery and determination of the Radium Girls that the truth was finally revealed. The trial was a dramatic and emotional roller coaster, with the Radium Girls facing off against their former employers in a battle for justice. And as the verdict was finally delivered, the Radium Girls had won a major victory. But at what cost? And this is where the true horror of the story begins to sink in. The aftermath of the trial was a mixed bag, with some of the Radium Girls receiving compensation for their injuries, but many others dying before they could see justice served. The companies were forced to implement safety measures and regulations to protect their workers. But it was too little, too late, for the Radium Girls, who had already suffered irreparable damage. The legacy of the Radium Girls lives on, however, as a testament to the power of courage and determination in the face of overwhelming adversity, and as a reminder of the importance of protecting workers' rights and prioritizing safety and health in the workplace. The Radium Girls may have lost their battle with radiation poisoning, but they won a major victory in the fight for justice, and their story will continue to haunt us, a reminder of the darker side of history, and the importance of never forgetting the sacrifices of those who came before us. And this is where the story of the Radium Girls comes full circle. A cautionary tale about the dangers of industrial greed and the importance of fighting for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe for more dark history tales.